On April 12, 1951, at 06:28 hours, over the Pacific Ocean aboard USS Hancock, carrier aviation faced a crisis. The jet age had arrived faster than landing doctrine could adapt. F-9F Panthers returned from sorties over Korea, with fuel gauges trembling near empty, pilots exhausted, decks pitching in swells. That morning's operational log recorded 17 attempted landings, 4 wave-offs, 2 barrier crashes. The loss rate stood at 8.3% per 100 recoveries. Commander Watts reviewed the numbers in the ready room while coffee cooled in his cup. One name appeared repeatedly in the incident reports, always on the edge of acceptable procedure, always surviving. Lieutenant Commander A.J. Daniels had landed his Panther using a technique no training manual described. The file noted only, "Unorthodox approach, under review." Within 6 months, that technique would be standard across the fleet. At 07:06 hours on April 12, 1951, aboard USS Hancock operating 40 nautical miles east of Wonsan, the sea spread flat and grey beneath scattered cloud. The flight deck measured 872 feet from bow to stern, a margin that seemed generous until a 12,000-pound jet approached at 105 knots with less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining. Lieutenant Commander Ace Daniels, 31 years old, stood beside his F-9F-2 Panther on the port side of the deck. Salt spray had dried in white streaks across the fuselage. He checked his watch, then his kneeboard card, sortie number 247 for the deployment. His role involved combat air patrol over the carrier group, occasional ground attack runs along the eastern coast, and the return, the part that mattered most. The arresting gear stretched across the deck in 4 parallel cables, each one capable of stopping 15 tons of aircraft in 2 seconds. The system worked when everything aligned: speed, angle, hook deployment, deck motion, wind over the bow. Any deviation meant a bolter, a wave-off, or worse. Daniels had seen 3 pilots lost in barrier crashes during the past month. The statistics lived in his mind. He climbed the boarding ladder, settled into the cockpit and began his pre-flight checks. Engine instruments, fuel quantity, hydraulic pressure, everything measured normal. The deck crew signalled, and he taxied forward. The catapult officer raised his flag. At 07:42, Daniels launched into morning air that smelled of kerosene and ocean salt. 4 hours later, he would return. The landing would be different. At 08:23 hours, Commander William Watts stood on the bridge of USS Hancock reviewing the morning's operational reports. Watts, 43, had commanded carrier air operations for 9 months. Before him lay incident summaries typed on yellow carbon copies, 3 barrier engagements overnight, 1 aircraft written off after the tail hook failed to engage any wire, pilot recovered, aircraft lost. The numbers troubled him more than the individual incidents. Over the previous 30 days, landing accidents had consumed 8.3% of attempted recoveries. The F-9F Panther, Bureau number specifications indicated, carried fuel for approximately 2.8 hours of flight at combat power settings. Margin for multiple approach attempts, minimal. Lieutenant Hargrove entered with additional logs. "Sir, we've had another close call. Panther 36 made a non-standard approach yesterday. Came in steeper than doctrine allows. Caught the 2-wire. Watts studied the entry. The pilot's name appeared again. Daniels. "Steeper approach means higher sink rate," Watts said. "That should increase the risk of a ramp strike." Hargrove nodded. "That's what the manual says, but he's done it 4 times now. No incidents." The wind outside shifted, and Watts watched the deck crew adjust their positions. The carrier itself presented limitations. Wind over the deck varied with ship's course and natural conditions. The landing area allowed no room for error. Something in the system required change, but regulations moved slowly. Innovation in wartime meant risk. Watts made a note in the margin of the report. Monitor Panther 36 approaches. Request detailed analysis. At 10:45 hours, in the ready room beneath the flight deck, Ace Daniels stood before 16 pilots from VF-51 and VF-52. The compartment smelled of hydraulic fluid and cigarette smoke. A large status board covered one bulkhead, listing aircraft numbers, pilot assignments, and maintenance conditions. Daniels had flown carrier aircraft since 1944, first in prop-driven Hellcats, now in jets that approached twice as fast. The transition had been documented in training reports and accident statistics. The approach speed for a Panther is listed at 105 knots, Daniels began. That's what the manual specifies, but when you come in at that speed, you're committed early. If the deck drops in a swell, you can't compensate. He walked to the chalkboard and drew a simplified landing profile. I've been adjusting my technique, coming in slightly steeper, slightly slower at the ramp. It gives me more control in the last 3 seconds. Lieutenant Kerrigan, 24, raised his hand. That contradicts the training profile. Slower means higher angle of attack, more risk of stall? It does, Daniels acknowledged. But the stall margin on the Panther is wider than the training assumed. I've tested it at 92 knots with full flaps. Still controllable. Silence settled over the room. What Daniels described violated established procedure, yet his landing record spoke clearly. In 247 carrier approaches, he had never bolted more than once per recovery. The average across the air group stood at 1.7 bolters per recovery. I'm not saying everyone should try this, Daniels continued. I'm saying the doctrine may not match the aircraft's actual capabilities. He sat down. The briefing officer made no comment, but his pen moved across the notepad. At 13:30 hours on April 14th, Daniels returned from a patrol mission northeast of the carrier. Fuel. Remaining 340 pounds. Enough for one approach. The sea state had increased since morning. Swells rolled from the northwest at 8 feet, causing the deck to pitch through a 6-degree arc. He entered the landing pattern at 800 feet, configuring the aircraft, landing gear down, flaps full, tailhook extended. The landing signal officer stood on the port side of the deck, paddles raised. Daniels descended through 400 feet, airspeed steady at 98 knots. At the ramp, he reduced power slightly and raised the nose. The aircraft settled faster than standard procedure prescribed, descending at 720 feet per minute. The tailhook struck the deck between the 1-wire and 2-wire, caught the 2-wire, and the Panther decelerated in 312 feet. Daniels felt the familiar surge as the wire pulled taut, then the smooth rollout as tension released. He taxied clear, watching deck crew sprint forward to reset the arresting gear. In the ready room, 30 minutes later, the landing signal officer reviewed the approach with him. You came in steep. Sink rate was 200 feet per minute above the recommended profile. Yes, sir, Daniels replied, but I caught a good wire on the first pass. The LSO marked his grade sheet. Fair. In the remarks section, he wrote, non-standard approach. Effective results. By evening, 3 other pilots had asked Daniels about his technique. He explained the principle. Controlled energy management in the final seconds, accepting higher sink rate in exchange for better deck motion compensation. The idea spread quietly through the squadron. No formal instruction, just observation and conversation. 2 days later, Lieutenant Morrison attempted a similar approach and caught the 3-wire on his first pass after 4 previous bolters that day. At 16:07 hours on April 17th, Commander Watts called Daniels to the operations center. The compartment held radar repeaters, communication terminals, and status boards tracking the air group's location and condition. Watts stood beside a desk covered with approach analysis charts. Lieutenant Commander, I've been reviewing your landing patterns. Your sink rates exceed the recommended profile by an average of 180 feet per minute. Your approach speeds run 7 to 11 knots below specification. Daniels stood at attention. Yes, sir. The technique provides better control in variable deck conditions. The technique, Watts said, violates the Bureau of Aeronautics landing doctrine issued in 1949. That doctrine exists because engineers calculated the safest approach profile for these aircraft. With respect, sir, that doctrine was written for the F-9 F-2 operating from shore bases and larger carriers. Hancock's deck presents different variables. Watts studied the charts again. The data contradicted his expectations. Lower approach speeds should have increased landing accidents. Instead, Daniels's record showed consistent single-pass recoveries. I'm not authorizing this technique for the air group, Watts said, but I'm not ordering you to stop. Continue your current approach profile. I'll document the results and forward them to Fleet Headquarters. Daniels nodded. Understood, sir. The conversation ended without resolution. Watts recognized innovation when he saw it. But regulations existed for reasons written in previous accident reports. Changing doctrine required evidence, testing, and approval through channels that moved slowly, even during wartime. That evening, Watts drafted a message to Commander Fleet Air West Coast. Request evaluation of non-standard carrier approach techniques observed aboard Hancock. Preliminary data suggests reduced bolter rates. Recommend controlled testing. The message traveled by radio to Pearl Harbor, then by courier to San Diego. 3 weeks would pass before a reply arrived. By early May 1951, 7 pilots in the air group had adopted variations of Daniels' approach technique. The landing signal officers tracked the results with increasing interest. Average bolter rate for those 7 pilots, 0.9 per recovery. Average for the remaining pilots, 1.8 per recovery. The difference appeared in the daily operations summaries, though no official notice was taken. On May 8th, at 07:55 hours, Daniels briefed the technique formally for the first time. The ready room filled with pilots from both squadrons. He explained the principles using diagrams on the chalkboard. Standard approach assumes steady-state conditions, constant wind over the deck, level deck attitude. But those conditions rarely exist. The deck moves, wind shifts. You need a technique that accommodates variables. He outlined the method. Establish a slightly slower air speed at the 90-degree position. Plan for a steeper glide slope. Accept higher sink rate in the final 3 seconds while maintaining precise angle of attack control. The key, he emphasized, is power management. You're trading kinetic energy for potential energy earlier in the approach. That gives you more options when the deck moves. Questions followed. How slow is too slow? What if the deck rises in a swell? How does this work in a crosswind? Daniels answered each one with specifics drawn from 276 carrier landings. The session lasted 40 minutes. Commander Watts observed from the back of the room. He said nothing during the briefing, but afterward he pulled Daniels aside. That was informative, but it's still not authorized doctrine. If someone crashes using your technique, this becomes my responsibility. Understood, sir. Keep documenting your results. I need data, not theory. Daniels returned to his stateroom and opened his logbook. He had started recording detailed approach parameters 3 months earlier. Airspeed, sink rate, wire caught, fuel remaining, sea state. The numbers told a clear story. On May 23, 1951, at 10:23 hours, Daniels prepared for a recovery that would test every element of his technique. The morning mission had extended due to increased enemy activity near Wonsan. Fuel remaining. 280 pounds, barely sufficient for one approach. Wind over the deck measured 18 knots, gusting to 24. The deck pitched through 7 degrees as the carrier took swells from the port quarter. Daniels entered the pattern at 600 feet, scanning instruments and visual references simultaneously. Airspeed 96 knots, rate of descent 620 feet per minute. He watched the deck rise and fall, timing his approach to arrive as the deck reached the top of its arc. The landing signal officer held paddles steady, then gave a slight power signal. Daniels advanced the throttle minutely, correcting for a wind gust. At the ramp, the deck began dropping. Standard procedure called for adding power and climbing away for another attempt. Instead, Daniels maintained his descent rate, letting the aircraft settle onto the deck as it dropped beneath him. The tail hook caught the 2-wire. The arresting cable pulled taut with a force of 45,000 pounds, decelerating the Panther from 94 knots to 0 in 2.1 seconds. Daniels felt the pressure against his harness, then the release as deck crew unhooked the cable. He taxied forward and yellow-shirted handlers directed him to the parking spot. Fuel remaining, 140 pounds. Margin for a second attempt, none. In the ready room, Lieutenant Morrison approached him. "That was the roughest deck motion I've seen all month. You made it look routine." "It's about timing," Daniels replied. "You have to work with the deck motion, not fight it." The landing signal officer entered his grade in the log. OK pass. 3 wires, acceptable technique, challenging conditions. By afternoon, 4 more pilots had requested individual briefings on approach timing and energy management. At 15:30 hours on June 4th, Commander Watts convened a meeting in the Air Operations Office. Present, the Air Group Commander, both squadron commanding officers, the landing signal officers, and Daniels. On the table lay 3 months of landing data, compiled by the ship's operations department. "Gentlemen," Watts began, "the numbers require attention. Since early April, we've seen an 80% reduction in barrier crashes. Bolter rates have decreased by 47%. These changes correlate directly with adoption of Lieutenant Commander Daniels' approach technique." He distributed copies of the analysis. The data showed clear trends. Pilots using the modified approach technique averaged 0.8 bolters per recovery. Traditional approach pilots averaged 1.7 bolters. Fuel consumption during recovery operations had decreased by 12% due to fewer wave-offs and pattern re-entries. "This technique," Watts continued, "has demonstrated measurable safety improvements under operational conditions. I'm recommending it be adopted as standard procedure for this air group, pending formal evaluation by the Bureau of Aeronautics." The Air Group Commander, Captain Morrison, studied the report. "This contradicts current doctrine. We'll need approval from fleet level before making it mandatory." "Agreed," Watts said, "but we can teach it as an optional technique immediately. The results speak for themselves." He turned to Daniels. "Lieutenant Commander, you'll prepare a training syllabus, include approach parameters, power settings, and deck motion compensation procedures. We'll begin formal instruction next week." Daniels nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll have it ready." The meeting concluded with administrative details, documentation requirements, safety review procedures, and communication with fleet headquarters. As the officers filed out, Watts remained behind with Daniels. "You've changed how this air group operates, and that's not a small thing." "I just worked with what the aircraft could do, sir." "That's what innovation is," Watts replied, "finding capability no one else recognized." The formal message to fleet headquarters transmitted that evening. USS Hancock reports significant reduction in carrier landing incidents following adoption of modified approach technique. Request Bureau of Aeronautics evaluation and potential fleet-wide implementation. On July 18, 1951, at 13:22 hours, weather conditions deteriorated rapidly over the operating area. A typhoon developing southeast of Japan pushed storm cells across the carrier's position. Wind over the deck increased to 35 knots with gusts to 44. Rain reduced visibility to less than 1 mile. Sea state built to 12-foot swells, causing the deck to pitch through 11 degrees and roll through 8 degrees. The air group was airborne, completing scheduled patrols. They would have to recover in conditions that approached the operational limits for carrier aviation. Commander Watts studied the meteorological reports with increasing concern. 6 aircraft currently in the pattern, fuel states ranging from critical to minimal. The storm would not pass for another 3 hours. Waiting was not an option. At 13:40, the first Panther entered the approach pattern. The landing signal officer, Lieutenant Briggs, watched through rain that streaked his goggles. The aircraft descended through turbulence, wings rocking slightly in the gusts. At the ramp, a wind shift pushed the Panther left of centerline. Briggs waved off the attempt. The pilot climbed away, fuel gauge dropping toward empty. Daniels flew the 4th aircraft in the pattern. He monitored the radio calls, hearing the tension in voices as fuel states decreased and approach conditions worsened. His own fuel measured 320 pounds, enough for 1 solid attempt, possibly 2. He established his approach at 92 knots, slightly slower than his usual profile. The reduced speed gave him more control authority in the gusting wind. Descending through 300 feet, he felt the aircraft buffeted by turbulence. The deck appeared intermittently through curtains of rain, rising and falling through its maximum arc. He adjusted power continuously, compensating for wind variations. At the ramp, he saw the deck dropping away in a swell. Instead of climbing away, he continued the approach, controlling the descent rate precisely. The tailhook touched the deck as it reached its lowest point in the roll, catching the 3-wire. The cable arrested his aircraft in 289 feet. At 15 onward hours, all 6 aircraft had recovered aboard. No barrier crashes, no wave-offs after initial attempts. The technique Daniels had developed, controlled energy management with accommodation for deck motion, had proven effective under conditions that would normally have caused multiple incidents. In the ready room afterward, the landing signal officers conducted their debriefing. Lieutenant Briggs addressed the assembled pilots. That was textbook recovery in storm conditions. Every pilot who used the modified approach technique succeeded on the first or second pass. The 3 pilots using traditional approach profiles required an average of 3.2 attempts. Captain Morrison, the air group commander, entered the compartment. "Gentlemen, I've just received word from Fleet Headquarters. They've reviewed Commander Watts' report on the modified landing technique. Bureau of Aeronautics has authorized a formal evaluation program. They're sending a test pilot team to observe and document procedures." He looked at Daniels. "Lieutenant Commander, you'll be working with that team. They want detailed performance data, film documentation, and training materials. This technique may become standard across all Pacific Fleet carriers." Daniels felt the weight of the moment. What had begun as individual adaptation to operational conditions had become something larger, an innovation that could change fleet procedure. "Yes, sir. I'll provide whatever they need." The storm continued outside, but inside the ready room, a different kind of change was underway. Commander Watts pulled Daniels aside after the briefing. "The hard part's done. You proved the concept under combat conditions. Now comes the bureaucracy, testing, documentation, approval chains. That process could take months." "I understand, sir. But the technique works." Today proved that conclusively. In 20 years of carrier aviation, I've never seen better results in weather like this. The wind howled past the island's superstructure, carrying rain across the flight deck. Below decks, in maintenance spaces and ready rooms, The normal rhythm of carrier operations continued, but the numbers in the operations log told a story that would echo through fleet aviation for years to come. By August 1951, the Bureau of Aeronautics Evaluation team had completed their analysis. The team included 3 test pilots, 2 aeronautical engineers, and a flight test documentation specialist. They observed 187 carrier approaches by pilots trained in Daniels' technique. They reviewed film from deck-mounted cameras. They analyzed aircraft performance data and interviewed pilots about control inputs and decision-making during approaches. Their report, dated August 29, 1951, concluded, "Modified approach technique demonstrates statistically significant improvement in carrier landing safety, recommended for fleet-wide adoption pending formal training program development. The numbers were documented with precision. Average bolter rate reduced from 1.7 to 0.8 per recovery. Barrier crash rate reduced from 8.3 to 1.6 per 100 landings. Fuel consumption during recovery operations reduced by 11%. The technique worked because it aligned with aircraft capabilities rather than theoretical approach profiles. The F-9F Panther possessed greater slow speed control authority than the original landing doctrine recognized. By operating at slightly reduced air speeds with steeper approach angles, pilots gained more time and more options for compensating when deck conditions varied." At 17:05 hours on September 3rd, Commander Watts gathered the air group in the forward hangar bay. Rain drummed on the overhead deck, but the space was dry and lit by overhead fluorescence. "Gentlemen," Watts announced, "I've received formal notification from Commander Fleet Air Pacific. The modified carrier approach technique developed and tested aboard this ship has been approved for fleet-wide implementation. All Pacific Fleet carrier squadrons will receive training in the procedure beginning next month." He paused, letting the significance settle. Lieutenant Commander Daniels' innovation has been incorporated into Bureau of Aeronautics doctrine. It will be taught at Pensacola, at Corpus Christi, at every training command in the Navy. It will save lives for years to come. Applause filled the hangar bay. Daniels stood near the back, uncomfortable with attention. He had simply solved a problem using observation and analysis. The fact that it became doctrine seemed almost incidental. Watts found him afterward. "You should feel proud. This is your legacy." "It's just a better way to land, sir." "It's more than that. You changed the system." At 10 Wickle hours on September 15, 1951, Daniels launched on what would be his final combat mission from USS Hancock. The deployment was ending. The carrier would return to San Diego for maintenance and crew rotation. His Panther carried external fuel tanks and a full load of ammunition for patrol duties over the coast. The mission lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. He flew north of Wonsan, maintaining station at 15,000 feet, watching for enemy aircraft that never appeared. The war continued, but the intensity had decreased. Armistice negotiations had begun. Combat operations continued, but everyone sensed the approaching end. At 14:20, he returned to the ship for his final landing. The technique he had developed was now standard across the air group. The landing signal officers taught it to new pilots arriving aboard. The numbers in the operations log showed consistent improvement. Fewer crashes, fewer injuries, fewer aircraft lost to landing accidents. He flew the approach at 94 knots, descending through clear afternoon air. Wind over the deck measured 22 knots, steady. Sea state calm. The deck remained nearly level. At the ramp, he reduced power and raised the nose slightly. The tailhook caught the 2-wire. The aircraft stopped smoothly. He taxied to the parking area and shut down the engine. The silence after flight always felt profound. The absence of engine noise, the return of human sounds, voices, equipment, footsteps on the deck. Climbing down from the cockpit, he was met by Commander Watts and the Air Group Commander. "Welcome back," Watts said. "That was number 312, correct?" "Yes, sir." "All of them successful recoveries. That's a remarkable record." Daniels pulled off his helmet. "Good aircraft, good deck crew, good technique." "You're being modest," Captain Morrison said. "Your innovation changed how the Navy lands on carriers. That's not a small contribution." Daniels looked across the flight deck. Other aircraft were returning, each one following the approach pattern he had developed and refined over months of operational testing. The pattern had become routine, no longer remarkable. That, he thought, was the mark of successful innovation, when it becomes invisible because everyone uses it. At 12:14 hours on September 18th, Daniels sat in his stateroom reviewing deployment records. In his logbook, he had recorded every landing for the past 7 months. Approach speed, sink rate, wire caught, fuel remaining, sea state, wind conditions. 312 entries, each one a data point in a larger pattern. The numbers showed consistent results. Average approach speed, 95 knots. Average sink rate, 680 feet per minute. Average wire caught, 2 wire. Bolter rate, 0.7 per recovery. The Bureau of Aeronautics had requested his logs for inclusion in their analysis. The detailed records would help develop training standards for the new doctrine. On his desk lay a letter from the Chief of Naval Operations. It commended his development of improved carrier landing procedures and noted the measurable improvement in fleet safety. The language was formal, bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. His work had made a difference. He thought about the pilots who had died in barrier crashes during the previous year. Names he knew, men he had flown with. The technique he developed could not bring them back, but it might prevent similar losses in the future. That mattered more than recognition. His deployment was ending, but the technique would continue. It was now documented in training manuals, taught in flight schools, practiced on every carrier in the Pacific Fleet. The innovation had moved from individual adaptation to institutional knowledge. Outside his stateroom, the carrier maintained its routine. Aircraft launched and recovered. Maintenance crews worked on engines and airframes. The galley prepared meals. The watchstanders monitored instruments. The rhythm of carrier operations continued, slightly safer now because of what he had discovered. He closed his logbook and packed it with his other gear. Tomorrow, USS Hancock would enter San Diego Harbor. His combat deployment would officially end, but the technique he developed would continue flying, on carriers he would never see, with pilots he would never meet. That legacy, quiet and technical and documented in operational logs, would endure long after the war ended.